This video is just going to be a little bit about cell signaling. So what exactly is cell signaling? It's basically the mechanism by which cells communicate with each other through long and short distances. So they can communicate for many purposes, pretty much to a lot of the time to respond to stimuli and external factors around them. Sometimes even to respond to cues from neighboring cells. Um, a lot of the times it's also to initiate gene expression of DNA. So, like basically to copy DNA into mRNA and create proteins to initiate that process, and pretty much overall to maintain a stable internal condition or homeostasis. So, moving on to the types of cell signaling. We have direct cell-cell communication, which is a type of local cell signaling. This involves two cells that are in close contact with each other, physically contact each other in order to communicate. They do this by actually connecting the cytoplasms. For example, in plasmodesmata in plant cells, the two cytoplasms of both cells, these blue parts that you see over here, connect and they allow the passage of small messenger molecules known as intracellular mediators. And this allows the two cells to communicate and exchange information. We can also see this process, something similar in animal cells, actually in the human body immune system. So you have this leukocyte or white blood cell here, and then a virus ends up being engulfed by this cell, and this white blood cell or leukocyte actually ends up breaking this virus down and displaying pretty much a piece of that virus or information of that virus on its receptor on the surface here. That's what you see over here. This is the surface. Now, this allows cells in its area, so like this killer T cell, to come read this antigen right here. The piece of the virus that's displayed on the surface is known as the antigen. So this killer T cell, or pretty much any other cell involved in immune response, can read this antigen and actually gain some information about this virus, and it can decide to create an actual response. So that can be an actual full-blown immune response. Um, so it can be a full-blown immune response or whatever the cell decides to do pretty much. Um, so that's just a couple examples of direct cell-cell communication. Um, Moving on to slightly longer distance cell communication. So we have pericardine signaling, which pretty much involves um, a secreting cell which releases a molecule known as a ligand, which is a signaling molecule. So it releases a ligand, and this ligand is pretty much destined to go to like a very specific target cell, as they call it. This target cell has very specific receptors that can actually come in contact with the signaling molecule and actually receive the information. So this receptor has to fit the shape of the ligand. If it does not fit the shape of the ligand, then that means this ligand cannot go to that receptor. It needs to be a specific receptor binding to a specific ligand. That's why there's a specific target cell and a secreting cell that's sending specific information to particular cells in its area. So that's pericardine signaling, which is pretty much just very close distance, but it involves a ligand. You also have similar concept, which is endocrine signaling, which is also involves signaling molecules, but it's more long distance. Long distance. Um, and for example, the pituitary gland in the endocrine system, it releases growth factors, and other hormones. It releases many hormones, which are basically long distance signals, pretty much just like this ligand. They're long distance communicators and signaling molecules, which reach many cells, and it basically amplifies the signal and reaches many cells at the same time. So that's more endocrine signaling. For example, the pituitary gland often sends out growth factors, which stimulates cells to grow. So that's an example of endocrine or long distance cell communication. It often involves the transport of these hormones through the bloodstream across the body, through the bloodstream. So that's just three examples of cell-cell communication. We also have like the more detailed parts of this process, which is you see the sending cell, or as we saw earlier, this the secreting cell. Um, as the cell sends these ligands to a very specific target cell, this receptor right here, this receptor binds with the ligand or the signaling molecule, and this actually um, ends up passing on a message to this target cell, and this target cell ends up actually breaking that message down through a series of chemical reactions and actually ends up giving you a response at the end. So this response can be proliferation, cell growth, expression of a certain gene, pretty much whatever this message is. Um, Again, you see over here the non-target cells. So cells that don't have the specific receptor for this ligand will not come in contact with this ligand because they don't have the receptor to bind to. And pretty much this cell will never receive the message that this secreting cell is trying to spread. That's what it says over here. It's very specific. Um, And pretty much it involves three steps, like we said earlier. The ligand binding to the receptor over here, you see how it fits the shape of the ligand. It has a perfect circular shape here. This is known as reception. So this is generally known as step one of cell signaling. And then the step two, I guess you can call it, would be over here when there's a series of chemical reactions that converts the message received by this ligand into an actual response. This is called transduction. So there's many different transduction pathways in cells and different mechanisms by which this message is essentially decoded. And then one common one is the phosphorylation cascade. Phosphorylation cascade, which pretty much involves the phosphorylation of many molecules, and it pretty much creates a cascade of reactions and ends up resulting in a response. And this part right here is pretty much just as it says here, response. So this involves the cell's actual response to this message that it received in the form of a ligand. So going back to types of cell signaling, there's actually one more type of cell signaling, which is known as autocrine cell signaling. So autocrine cell signaling pretty much involves a cell communicating with itself. So it passes on, so pretend that's a cell, it passes on a ligand, and this binds to the receptor on another part of the surface of the cell. So pretend this ligand moves all the way over here and actually binds to this receptor on the other side of the cell, and this ends up creating a cascade of transduction reactions essentially, and that results in some sort of response. This can be seen very commonly in cancer cells. So cancer cells don't actually wait for the pituitary gland to send growth factors. Instead, they create their own growth factors in the forms of ligands, and they actually signal themselves to start growing. And that's why many times cancer cells um, are uncontrollably growing, and their proliferation is pretty much just self regulated.